Ambassador Gir, thank you for this interview. First of all, let me start by asking you, let's clarify the dilemmas. Has Macedonia officially started the negotiations with the European Union, or has some kind of an initial phase for the negotiation been started? What is the difference, and why is the terminology for Macedonia and Albania different?
Well, thanks, Jovan, for the question. I mean, first of all, it's really good news that last week the European Union launched accession negotiations with North Macedonia and with Albania. And I promise you, even in the last few months, I couldn't be sure that I'd be able to say that now. So it's excellent news. It's a historic development, both for the countries concerned, but also for the European Union. And we went beyond that. On the same day, the screening process was also launched. So the countdown to the entry of North Macedonia into the European Union has started. Now you ask about the differences between North Macedonia and Albania and the relevant documents. It's actually relatively normal to have differences between each accession process to a certain degree. In this case, it basically boils down to the following. We had what we call an intergovernmental conference last week launching the process. We've now started the screening process, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later on. At the end of that process, North Macedonia would have a second intergovernmental conference. And in order for that intergovernmental conference to take place, North Macedonia needs to fulfill the commitment that it's made to Bulgaria to change the constitution in order to have an explicit reference to people, to citizens who identify as Bulgarian within the protections of the constitution itself. But because this condition is a condition which is in the hands of North Macedonia, this in no way should result in delays or serve as an obstacle to the process, since there is no other party or country which would stop this second intergovernmental conference from taking place.
So just in short, to be clear, have you started negotiations, yes or no?
Absolutely. You've started, and it's good news.
You've mentioned the screening process. There are doubts as to whether the real screening process has begun and whether the negotiating framework has been adopted. We've just talked about that, but will it be done after the constitutional amendments?
So let's be clear.
Yes.
First of all, the screening process has begun, and the negotiating framework has been adopted by the Council, so that's already there. Now, what is the screening process? Because this is where people get a bit confused. It's not very simple, but basically there are two stages in the screening process. There is what's called an explanatory screening, which is when the European Commission, together with North Macedonia and Albania, looks at the overall process, reviews that process, looks at what needs to be done during that process. Now, both countries actually are already well advanced on that because of the preparatory work that took place some years ago. Then there is a second stage, the bilateral screening, which is a very structured and intensive in dialogue, which could last some 14 to 16 months in totality, and in which the European Commission looks at the norms and the legislation in force here in North Macedonia and in Albania, looks at the gaps, identifies where those gaps need to be filled, identifies what benchmarks need to be made for progress. So it's a very intensive and structured process. It's very different from what the European Commission has been doing for a number of years, which is a general monitoring of the country's progress in implementing EU-related reforms. You probably know that we also produce every year an annual report. That is something very different. It is much lighter. It is not structured as comprehensive as the screening process, and the two should not be confused.
What if the majority for changing the constitution, I'm talking about the parliamentary majority, for inserting the Bulgarians is not secured in the expected period of time, given that there is currently no two-thirds majority in the parliament? What would that change in the future? Because you mentioned that the second intergovernmental conference is basically linked with that. What would that change?
The change to the constitution is a sovereign decision for this country to take. That's absolutely clear. But the country has already a good record in inter-ethnic relations, and by making such a change, that would further solidify the progress that's been achieved in that area. And it's interesting because this idea of the changing of the constitution has been something which has been in various stages of the negotiations before the French presidency, even last year. And it was interesting that at that time I didn't hear many objections to this change in itself. So one has to ask why the opposition now. But in any event, you're asking what happens if we don't do it. Well, given that the framework has been adopted by the Council already, if the constitutional change is not taken, I would imagine the most likely scenario would be that the process would simply stop there. In other words, that the screening would have continued to a point and then it would stop awaiting the country. Not because a third country has vetoed or intervened, but because the country itself has decided to step back from the commitments that it's made bilaterally to Bulgaria on this issue.
The opposition party, the largest opposition party, ВМРО, is considering a referendum on the issue. The question is yet to be defined, but it's clear that it will be against the French proposal. Hypothetically, if it's successful, can it change anything in the EU documents?
Now you ask what would happen hypothetically if the country was to decide, despite that strategic goal, we're going to step back.
Can it change something? If there is a referendum, if the referendum is successful, can it change something in the European documents, in the framework and everything?
Hypothetically, in this world, hypothetically, most things are possible. But that's not the question. The question is it realistic or likely? And when you consider that this negotiation process didn't begin on the 30th of June, it actually began back in 2020, in the autumn of 2020. You had the German presidency of the European Union. You had the Portuguese, the Slovenes, and finally the French, all working intensively to try to overcome the difficulties and achieve the result which has now been achieved. So when viewed from that perspective of how difficult it was to reach that, then one has to ask how likely is it that the documents could be changed. In my personal view, I think it's unlikely in the short or medium term.
The main fear of the opposition is that instead of Europeization of the country, we will enter in a phase of bilateral issues or bilateralization. So instead of criteria and reforms, progress will depend on the historical commission. Are there any guarantees that this will be avoided?
During the discussion concerning what was then the French proposal, which later was adopted as the framework, there was an enormous amount of anxiety and sometimes even fear in people about the identity of the country. And people were concerned that by joining or by the accession process itself, would they lose their identity on the way? Well, I can assure you that the accession process will be carried out on the basis of European principles and European standards. Look, just putting it quite simply, do you think the Spanish became less Spanish by joining the European Union? The Estonians less Estonian, the Maltese less Maltese, so why should the Macedonians become less Macedonian by engaging in the process? But you asked me a question, can you give guarantees?
Yes.
And the answer to that is you can never give guarantees in the accession process that a country, whichever, may try to bring in bilateral issues. No negotiating framework for any country provides that. And this one is exactly the same. But what this negotiating framework doesn't do, it doesn't create new powers or new opportunities for such a process, introduction of bilateral issues. So I'm pretty confident in this approach.
And my last questions, for a long time there's been talk of fatigue for EU enlargement. We know that Serbia and Montenegro have been negotiating for a decade, if I'm not mistaken. They are far from admission to the EU. When can Macedonia in reality hope for admission in the most optimistic scenario?
I don't want to give you dates because of course you would love me to say by this date the country will join. I've heard 2030, I heard 2033, many different dates. It will depend upon the speed with which the reforms are implemented. But I'm very confident. This is a really positive dynamic we're in now. We have started negotiations. The country has reason to be optimistic. The country has reason to be confident in its identity and in its European perspective. And when President von der Leyen came here, she mentioned the possibility that this country could be a front runner in the accession process. She referred there to the fact that the existing norms and legislation are aligned about 45% with that in the European Union. So I think we're in a positive dynamic. The process is moving forward, but there's a lot of work to do, a lot of reforms before the country becomes a full member of the European Union.
Ambassador Gir, thank you for this interview.
Thank you very much.